Okay, I think we're going to get started here today. I wanted to thank you all for joining us. This is the Customer Success webinar series specifically for Certificate Deployment 101. We have about a half hour of presentation material to cover, and then at the end we will have time for questions. We do have some moderators checking the Q&A section of the WebEx, so please put your questions there. I know there's two windows, there's both Q&A and chat, but if you use the Q&A, that's the best possible way to get your answer covered by us today. This session will be recorded and available for viewing at a later date. Details of that will be sent out to you after the webinar. So today your host will be myself, John Applebaugh. I'm a customer success specialist here at Jamf, and joining me is Nick Anderson from our technical support team. He's a technical support engineer. Going over our agenda today, we wanted to give you a broad overview of what things to be expected with certificate-based communication. Also, what are the details of how certificates are used in Jamf, as well as dive into what you can do to deploy a certificate using a configuration profile. Then we'll take a look at using SCEP and 802.1x for authentication. Again, there will be time for questions at the end. Please put that in the Q&A section of the WebEx screen. And as a reminder, this will be recorded and available for you at a later date. Diving right in, let's begin with covering some basics of certificate-based communication. So in the digital world, authentication is important in order to control access to protected services, whether it's your email, websites, or other data systems that you might have. Everyone's probably familiar with the basic username password for allowing access to those kind of systems. We can make it more difficult for unauthorized or man-in-the-middle attempts by increasing the number of characters used in a password or increasing the complexity of that password. We can also use randomization schemes to make it even more difficult for someone to break in or get unauthorized access. However, if you're looking for a much greater level of security, definitely using a cryptographic key is the most secure way to secure communication. And this is where certificates come into play. Some things that you might be familiar with already, things like HTTPS, those protected websites, as well as 802.1x networking, and even MDM is using a certificate to pass information back and forth. So what is a certificate? They're issued by an authority, so a certificate authority or CA, and that provides information on identification, much like your driver's license provides a lot of details about who you are to either an authority or someone else that you might be presenting that to. The data contained within that certificate allows for encrypted data to be transmitted back and forth. These can be installed on servers and sometimes within clients as well to provide identification to other servers or clients that are attempting to communicate. So essentially it's just a way of establishing trust between two systems.
Here's an example of an SSL certificate from apple.com. We can see the chain of trust from a third-party certificate provider in the website domain. The third-party root CA is trusted by all operating systems here, in this case VeriSign, and the chain provides a way for us to create a validation, a chain of trust to VeriSign from this local certificate. And the root vouches for the website so the browser and the user can succeed there. You'll see the certificate also contains information about the creator of the certificate as well as the issuer. When a device needs to contact a service, whether it's a web service or an internal system, it'll reach out and request access first. A reply will come back from the server, and in this scenario, a certificate is supplied to the device, which will verify that it's from a recognized source. In return, the device supplies its own certificate to the web server, and if it's recognized, both can talk to each other. Different scenarios will either be simpler or more complicated than this, but this is the general idea of how certificates work.
So now that we kind of covered the basics of what is a certificate, how does it work, what does it look like between a client and a server in terms of passing that back and forth, we're going to cover some things about certificates inside of Jamf Pro. There are numerous areas that you're probably familiar with within Jamf Pro that use certificates. Probably the biggest example that you might be familiar with is that Tomcat Apache Tomcat SSL that is used to identify devices connecting over HTTPS. Other things that you might be familiar with as well are like the Apple integrations, things like push certificates, the device enrollment program, GSX, etc. Those are all using a form of certificate to establish communication between the Jamf Pro server and those Apple services. Additionally, devices that are enrolled into Jamf Pro end up getting an enrollment certificate, typically issued by SCEP and an MDM profile. These, in addition, as a Jamf Pro administrator, you can also issue certificates through configuration profiles, which we'll show you in a bit.
For example, the security settings for macOS might be pretty familiar. Here we can require certificate-based authentication with Jamf Pro server, as well as set the conditions for SSL verification. Always accept during enrollment is suitable for most situations there.
Additionally, you might have noticed this setting within your Jamf Pro server. It's the public key infrastructure, or PKI. Jamf Pro is using a PKI to issue those enrollment certificates. These can be issued whenever there's an enrollment or re-enrollment, even if you have a third-party SSL certificate in place. You can view this within the global management settings. Additionally, there are other settings to configure, such as setting up an external certificate authority, as well as using Jamf as a SCEP proxy. We won't actually be covering those particular topics today in this webinar, but we did provide some links for documentation for you to reference, and we'll have that available as resources at the end of the presentation as well. So feel free to jot that down now or wait till the end of the presentation. So one of the most common ways that individuals are using Jamf Pro and certificates is by leveraging configuration profiles. You're likely familiar with configuration profiles, but just in case, we wanted to cover some general overview as it relates to certificates. We can deploy certificates for both iOS and macOS from Jamf Pro. On macOS, this actually installs within the computer keychain access, and you'll be able to see it whether it's sent to a user, it would be at a login level, or if it's sent to the device, it would be at a system level. All profiles, including those deploying certificates, can use variables. If you're not really familiar with the use of variables in configuration profiles, I've provided some links to documentation here as well. These are helpful in case you want to do something like maybe pull the username from the device from the inventory record to use when creating that certificate. We'll go over a couple use cases here today, from a simple certificate deployment to accessing wireless networks. For our examples, we'll be looking at configuration profiles, which can be either accessed under computers or devices, and the specific payloads for certificate, SCEP, and AD certificate.
If you wanted to deploy a single certificate, for example, a universal certificate needed to access a particular internal website, we want to create a configuration profile with an individual certificate payload in it. We can upload the certificate directly through the interface, which will store a copy of the certificate and then issue it directly to devices within the configuration profile. As with all profiles, we'll want to select an appropriate scope. Maybe we'll be sending it to all devices, or maybe a certain number of devices within a network segment. Once deployed, the profile will be installed on the device, and the certificate will be placed in the keychain. From the inventory, we can then see both the profiles and the certificates that happen to be installed on the device.
Another common scenario that we've run across, and a lot of you might be trying to do, is allowing the access to a VPN service for your remote employees. If we need to limit access based on Active Directory groups, we can actually configure an AD certificate payload. We would need to define where that certificate is coming from on your AD server, so the actual URL, and details about the template being used, which are all very specific to your environment and the end objective that you're trying to get. Once configured, we'll then be able to add the VPN payload to the profile and configure those VPN settings specific to whatever type of VPN you might be using. And then under the identity certificate portion, you'll want to select the AD certificate that we've configured in order to specify where that certificate should be coming from, what the certificate authority is for accessing VPN. And once again, we'll scope that profile appropriately. On the client, the profile will be installed and the device will connect to the AD server to obtain that certificate before connecting into your VPN server. So now that we've covered some of the basics of the deployment cases for both deploying a single certificate as well as maybe using AD for VPN access, we're going to look more at certificate authentication for network access. So SCEP, or Simple Certificate Enrollment Protocol, is commonly used and issues a unique certificate on demand and at scale. It's pretty widely accepted across the industry. In fact, Jamf Pro is using SCEP to issue those enrollment certificates. SCEP makes use of a defined template to generate those certificates for devices whenever they're requesting it. Within Jamf Pro, we can push out a profile to have enrolled devices request a certificate from that SCEP server, which is pretty versatile for connecting to a variety of services, wireless just being probably the most obvious for most people. So going back to the model that we discussed earlier, for a device to connect to an enterprise network, the situation is pretty much the same as what we demonstrated already. However, in this case, when the device goes to try to get the access to the server, it might receive a certificate back from the network. And then when it tries to send a reply, it may not have a certificate, or it might have the wrong certificate, in which case it's going to be rejected and the device won't be able to connect to that network.
To resolve this, we need to have an intermediary verify the device and issue the certificate needed to gain access. In this example, the device enrolls in Jamf and gains a profile for the network connection, which contains instructions for getting the certificate from the SCEP server. The device will request and receive a certificate from SCEP, which will then use that to gain access to the network. The network recognizes the certificate as being from a trusted source and grants access. This setup could be more complicated depending on the network, but we wanted to provide a broad overview of what's happening with 802.1x. To use SCEP for network access, we need to configure a SCEP payload to use with a network payload. Within the SCEP payload, we can define the template that's used by the server, what challenge is needed, retry behavior, as well as certificate expiration notifications. Certificates will be refreshed based on settings defined on the SCEP server itself. Next, we'll configure the network payload. Here we'll need to select WPA2 Enterprise in order to use 802.1x and select the appropriate protocols. We'll then have the option to select which payload is being used to generate the identity certificate. In this case, we'd select SCEP. Options will only be displayed here if we have the payload configured within the same profile. Either SCEP or AD certificate are acceptable options there. Lastly, we can select a trust certificate that may be needed to be used in addition to SCEP. Again, these settings will all depend on the specific scenario, and networking requirements may not apply in all situations. The profile should contain both the network and appropriate certificate payloads, being certificate, SCEP, or Active Directory. Deploying this way will ensure the correct certificates are selected when connecting to the network. If a certificate is deployed separately, the user will likely get prompted to select which certificate to use when attempting to connect to a network.
For networking, there are some basic terminology to familiarize yourself with. If you're using a certificate to authenticate to a network, the use of EAP TLS methodology is pretty much preferred as a standard. Although we didn't cover Radius, that's a remote authentication dial-in user service, you may have this set up in your environment for your network to verify devices that need to get access to your network. It's something to consider as part of your setup and configuration, but there really isn't anything specific in Jamf that you would need to configure or that would be impacted by Radius itself. So with that, we're kind of reached the end of the content that we wanted to cover with you today. We hope that we were going to give you a broad overview of kind of what is possible with certificates, give you an overview of what the technology can do, as well as talk about some basics of what you can do to deploy out certificates from Jamf Pro. There's definitely a lot you can do in this realm, and the specifics might be very unique to your environment. We welcome questions from the audience at this time. We will have this recorded for you to view at a later date. If you do have questions, we can be taken within the Q&A section of the WebEx. And as promised, here is a list of resources that might be helpful to you in your deployments, some of which cover topics that we didn't really get into today, things like being able to use Jamf as a SCEP proxy, as well as those profile variables that we mentioned. But something like semantic PKI might be of interest to you if you happen to use semantic already in your environment. So feel free to take a screenshot or write these down, whatever helps you. But I think they're useful for whatever you're trying to do on the networking side as well as certificates. So we have a question from James Butler. Basically asked if we can use SCEP in place of AD for VPN certs. So I think in our example we just showed AD certificates being used. I would imagine that you could potentially use SCEP as a certificate authority for issuing certs if they were needed for your VPN access.
I believe that if your VPN allows the certificate issued by any authority to connect to it, it should be fine. It's really more dependent at that point what your VPN expects for authentication.
So we had a question on whether or not Jamf is incorporating an AD certs proxy in place of, or I guess as an addition to what we do with SCEP proxy. I don't know of anything at this time. That would be something that would be great for feature requests, I guess, on Jamf Nation, so that it can be in front of our product team. So we had a question from Mike, asked, how does Cisco ICE integration work in this scenario? Yeah, that's a good question. That's something that we didn't cover today, but there is an integration with Cisco ICE, which is more high level than just deploying out a certificate. It would be basically a way of providing authentication access for your network, but it's all set up within Jamf instead of providing those instructions directly to the device through a profile. So in the example that we provided, did you use one config profile to set the SCEP settings and the network settings? So basically in that scenario, it's recommended whenever you're going to be deploying out a profile that has certificate information that you include whatever services that it might be needing to connect to. So in the case of like you have a wireless network that you're looking to connect to, you'll set a network payload as well as whatever certificate payloads that you need. So it might be that you need to add a single cert, just upload it. It might mean that you need to also have a SCEP profile in place as well. So combining it all in one is the best way to go, only because if you separate them, that will install certs on your device, but it's very likely that the end user will get not the access they want. They might be prompted to select a cert in order to access your network. But if you wanted to make it truly seamless, provide it all in the same profile, right?
Yep. Javier Garza, any issues with the renewal of certs when the payload has redistribute setting enabled? I don't believe that we have any issues around that right now. It's pretty seamless, actually, provided that at the given time that the certificate needs to be renewed, the certificate authority is still available for those computers. From George Casper, we had, can you talk more about some of the use cases for SCEP certificates? I've seen that used for VPN, as was mentioned previously. Wireless networks is a big one, and then email authentication, I believe, has also been used.
Hmm.
I believe the wording is, do you recommend adding a root certificate authority in a directory setup config profile or separately? It depends on whether your device would be connecting to the directory before the configuration profile is deployed. Otherwise, it should be completely fine to have that within the same payload.
So we had a question around how would you revoke a SCEP cert for a user that shouldn't have access any longer? That would probably likely be controlled by the SCEP server itself. So the determination of access would be based on what the SCEP is been issuing out, whether that's a valid cert or not.
And John, I believe, had mentioned earlier today that when we remove a configuration profile with a standard certificate in it, not necessarily a SCEP cert, the certificate may stay in the keychain on the system itself. So we would definitely say do that through the actual certificate authority rather than through the JSS.
Yep, and there are ways to revoke certificates by scripting it through certain commands that you can send out, but there isn't a configuration profile per se that could do that for you. It'd be either, manually doing it on the system itself, or, like I said, having a script that would remove that particular cert from the system. There's some other questions around kind of functionality that may be coming. I would just say that potentially just look at release notes as they come out for new versions of Jamf Pro. If you're not part of the beta program, if you haven't participated in the beta yet, that's a great way to see what new changes are coming and be able to test them out firsthand. So we mentioned briefly the use of Jamf Pro as a SCEP proxy. So instead of sending out a profile that actually has the device request the certificate, SCEP proxy would essentially be having the Jamf Pro do that request on behalf of the device. We didn't cover that topic in depth here, only because it gets a little bit maybe more advanced than what this webinar would allow. But we definitely do have some documentation on that as well. And since it is part of the product, it is supported. So if that's something you're looking to do, we would definitely recommend maybe reaching out to someone at Jamf here to have a conversation about the next steps, whether you've attempted and not gotten very far, or if you're looking for additional help. So there definitely were a number of questions that we didn't get to today. We're going to review those and see what we can do to help you out. I would suggest if you have specific situations going on where you need additional assistance, that's why there's the Jamf technical support to help you out. You can definitely get a hold of them through Jamf Nation or support@jamf.com. Jamf Nation is also a great resource for sharing ideas, as well as getting inclusion from the community as to what other people have tried, what's worked, what's failed. In terms of other resources, there's definitely, if you have suggestions about what you'd like to see in the future, we do have a feature request portion of Jamf Nation that we do monitor for things like improvements in products, but also improvements in other offerings as well. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up a little bit early today. I wanted to thank you all for coming. Again, this will be a recorded session, so it will be available to you for future viewing. If there's anything else we can do for you, just feel free to reach out through Jamf Nation, and we'll definitely give you some assistance. So thanks again.